The air inside Thorne's high-security research lab hung thick and acrid, a cocktail of ozone, scorched metal, and something sickly sweet, like burnt sugar. My boots crunched on glass shards and pulverized circuitry with every step, the sound amplified by the cavernous space. Overhead, sections of the reinforced ceiling had peeled back like tin foil, exposing twisted girders and a sliver of the overcast sky. This wasn't just a fire, it was an event. A uniformed officer stood by the main entrance, his face grim beneath the brim of his cap. He nodded a silent greeting as I ducked under the yellow tape, the plastic fluttering faintly in a phantom draft. The lead investigator, a burly man with a perpetually furrowed brow, met me halfway into the devastation. "Reed," the lead investigator grunted, his voice a low rumble. "Glad you're here. Thorne's lab. Looks like a clean sweep." I didn't comment, just let my gaze sweep over the wreckage. Dr. Aris Thorne. A brilliant, reclusive bioengineer, according to the preliminary brief. Now, just a name attached to this catastrophe. The initial reports had been boilerplate, catastrophic lab accident, possibly self-inflicted. Suicide, or a tragic miscalculation involving his groundbreaking, potentially world-changing research. The devastation certainly supported the narrative. Walls buckled inward, equipment reduced to smoking husks, data terminals melted into abstract sculptures of plastic and wire. The incident occurred sometime in the early hours, the lead investigator continued, gesturing vaguely towards the epicenter of the destruction, a raised platform where Thorne's primary research console once stood. Automated alarms went off, but by the time response teams got here, it was mostly contained. Self-sealing protocols kicked in, starved the fire of oxygen. Saved the whole complex from going up, apparently. I walked towards the platform, my eyes scanning, processing. Every scorch mark, every displaced piece of debris, told a story. The floor was a mosaic of shattered ceramics and carbonized insulation. The sheer force required to achieve this level of destruction was immense. It spoke of a massive energy release, uncontrolled and devastating. Thorne was central to the blast, the lead investigator said, his tone flat. What's left of him, anyway? The recovery team is still working the perimeter. We'll be moving him to the trauma center cold room awaiting examination once they're done. But from what we can tell, he was right at the heart of it. I knelt, ignoring the discomfort of the debris pressing into my knees through my trousers. My gloved fingers brushed against a shard of what might have been a monitor screen, its surface bubbled and warped. The heat here must have been astronomical. My eyes traced the patterns of charring on the remaining wall sections. Most of it fanned outward from the central platform, consistent with an explosive event. But then I saw it. Tucked behind a partially collapsed containment unit, a small section of the wall, no more than a foot square, displayed a peculiar burn pattern. Unlike the surrounding damage, which was a deep, uneven char, this patch was almost perfectly circular, a lighter, more uniform scorch. It looked like the imprint of a focused energy source, distinct from the broader, chaotic thermal signature of the main blast. It was subtle, easily overlooked amidst the widespread ruin, but it snagged my attention like a burr on wool. I pulled a small, high-magnification lens from my kit and examined the anomaly. Within the lighter circle, a faint, almost invisible residue shimmered. It wasn't soot. It had a crystalline glint, a silvery sheen that was completely out of place with the dull black and gray of the surrounding carbon. What's the initial assessment on the energy source? I asked, my voice low, not looking up. The lead investigator shifted his weight. Looks like a reactor core breach. Some kind of experimental energy conduit, judging by the schematics the corporate liaison gave us. Highly unstable, apparently. That would explain the widespread devastation, the intense heat, but not this. This precise, localized burn, and the glimmering residue, felt deliberate. A surgical strike within a hurricane. I carefully scraped a minute sample of the residue into a sterile vial. My mind raced, sifting through the variables. Uniformity in chaos. But this tiny detail, this anomalous burn and the shimmering trace, defied the simple narrative. It was too clean, too specific. The official story was already being written, an unfortunate genius, a dangerous experiment, a tragic end. But my gut, that persistent, nagging instinct that had served me well for years, told me a different story was waiting to be uncovered. Aris Thorne might have been brilliant, reclusive, and prone to risk, but this wasn't just an accident. And I was certain it wasn't suicide. Someone had been here. Someone had left their mark, carefully hidden within the destruction. And I intended to find them. The investigation had just begun. My mind raced, dissecting the image of the precise burn and the shimmering residue. A surgical strike within a hurricane. I had carefully scraped a minute sample into a sterile vial, but the answers I truly sought lay elsewhere. They lay with the man himself. Dr. Aris Thorne lay on the stainless steel table, covered by a white sheet, his form unnaturally still beneath the harsh overhead lights. The chief examiner, a woman with sharp, observant eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor, adjusted her spectacles. Thermal injuries, severe, the examiner began, her voice crisp, devoid of emotion. Consistent with extreme heat exposure, as expected from the lab's reported incident. She pulled back the sheet, revealing Thorne's upper torso. The skin was mottled, a grim tapestry of reds and purples, but what struck me was the distinct lack of a full body charring. The damage was significant, yes, but almost contained. Any signs of struggle? I asked, my gaze sweeping over his hands, his neck. She shook her head. None. No defensive wounds. No ligature marks. The initial assessment points to rapid incapacitation from the thermal event itself, or perhaps a sudden loss of consciousness prior to the main incident. She pointed to a specific area on his left forearm. See here? The blistering is uneven, deeper in some spots, shallower in others. If he was standing directly in the path of a uniform thermal blast, I'd expect a more consistent burn pattern. I leaned closer, my eyes tracing the lines she indicated. He was right. It was almost as if the heat had been directed, focused. And then, I saw it. A minute, almost imperceptible discoloration on the inside of his left wrist, near the pulse point. It wasn't a burn. It was a faint, bluish-gray smear, barely larger than a pinhead. What's this? I asked, pointing it out. The examiner frowned, peering through her loupe. Unusual. Doesn't appear to be a burn byproduct. Almost like a dye, or a fine particulate. She carefully swabbed the area. I'll run it through the spectrometer, but it's definitely not from the lab fire. Too cool, too localized. And the color. Nothing organic. My mind latched onto it. A non-lab related trace element. This was the first concrete crack in the accident theory. If Thorne had been incapacitated before the main thermal event, and something non-lab related was on his person, it opened a door. A very narrow, very dark door. And the cause of death? I pressed, needing more than just thermal damage. Asphyxiation due to smoke inhalation, complicated by severe thermal trauma, she stated, her gaze meeting mine. But the smoke inhalation doesn't fully account for the lack of struggle. It suggests he was either unconscious or already deceased before the most intense smoke reached him. Unconscious or deceased. The words echoed. This wasn't a tragic miscalculation. This was starting to feel like an execution, staged to look like an accident. The deliberate burn pattern, the lack of struggle, and now this unique trace on his wrist. Someone had gone to great lengths. Thorne wasn't just a victim of circumstance, he was a target. My next steps were clear. I needed to understand who had reason to want Thorne dead, and who possessed the knowledge to stage such an elaborate demise within his high-security domain. My first call was to the corporate liaison, requesting an immediate interview with Dr. Silas Vance, a known rival of Thorne's. Vance led the competing bioengineering division within the same conglomerate, and their professional animosity was legendary. The liaison, a harried man named Mr. Davies, agreed reluctantly, citing Vance's importance to ongoing projects. The interview took place in a sterile conference room within the corporate headquarters, far removed from the devastation. Vance, a man in his late 50s with thinning gray hair and an air of intellectual arrogance, sat across from me, his hands clasped on the polished table. A terrible tragedy, of course, Vance said, his tone flat, betraying little emotion. Aris was driven. Reckless, some might say. Always pushing boundaries without considering the fallout. Did you have any recent disagreements with Dr. Thorne? I asked, watching his eyes. He scoffed softly. Disagreements? Read, we practically lived in a state of perpetual disagreement. His research on cellular regeneration was encroaching on my team's intellectual property. We were due for a very tense meeting next week regarding shared patents. He had a habit of, shall we say, borrowing ideas and making them his own. Did this borrowing ever escalate beyond professional rivalry? Vance leaned back, a faint smile playing on his lips. Escalate? No. We're professionals. But I won't deny that his death, while tragic, does simplify certain proprietary disputes. His candor was unsettling, almost too easy. He provided a solid alibi, detailing a board meeting in a different city, with flight manifests and witness testimonies already prepared by his legal team. Too prepared, perhaps. Next, I tracked down Maya, a former research assistant who had worked closely with Thorne for years before abruptly resigning 6 months prior. Her contact information was in Thorne's personal files, flagged with a single, cryptic note, unreliable. I found her working at a small, independent lab across town, a stark contrast to Thorne's gleaming facility. He was younger, perhaps early 30s, with sharp features and an edgy demeanor. Thorne was a monster, Maya stated, her voice tight with suppressed anger, as we sat in a cramped break room that smelled faintly of burnt coffee. Brilliant, yes, but a monster. He took everything. my ideas, my weekends, my sanity. He'd lock himself in that lab for days, paranoid about anyone seeing his work. He'd rewrite my findings, claim credit for my breakthroughs. I left because I couldn't stand being erased anymore. Did he have any other enemies you know of? I probed. Everyone was an enemy to Thorne. He trusted no one. He was always convinced someone was trying to steal his magnum opus. He fired people for looking at him wrong. A security guard, an intern who accidentally spilled coffee near his workstation. He was obsessed, secretive to a fault. Did he ever mention anything specific about his final project? Maya hesitated, then leaned forward. He was working on something unprecedented. Something he claimed would change everything. He called it Project Chimera. He said it was his legacy, and anyone who tried to interfere would regret it. He was more paranoid than usual in the months before I left. He even installed new, highly specialized filtration systems in his personal lab. Said the air wasn't clean enough for his samples. Filtration systems. The word caught in my mind, a subtle echo of the unique trace element on Thorne's wrist. Was there a connection? Maya had no alibi beyond her word, claiming he was home alone, working on a personal project. Her motive was clear, fueled by resentment and professional sabotage. Vance, with his corporate rivalry and too convenient alibi, was another strong candidate. Both had plausible reasons, both had access to the corporate ecosystem. But neither of them explained the specific, localized burn, or that peculiar bluish-gray smear. My determination solidified. This was no accident. This was calculated. And I was just beginning to peel back the layers. The air in Thorne's private lab still tasted of ozone and something acrid, a metallic tang that clung to the back of my throat. The initial sweep had cleared the space for my team, but the scent lingered, a phantom reminder of the chaos that had unfolded here. I sat before Thorne's primary workstation, the screen a black mirror reflecting my own grim expression. The lead forensic technician, a quiet man with nimble fingers, had bypassed the encryption with practiced ease, his movements precise and economical. "It's open, read," the technician murmured, stepping back to give me space. I nodded, my gaze fixed on the desktop. It was surprisingly sparse, a clean slate that belied the complexity of the mind that had operated it. I navigated through the directories, my fingers brushing the cool keys. Thorne's research was compartmentalized, each project a nested labyrinth of files and subfolders. I focused on the most recently accessed directories, looking for anything out of place. The dates were a blur of activity, a relentless pursuit of some unknown goal. Deep within a folder labeled Project Chimera, I found it. The file names were cryptic, sequences of letters and numbers that meant nothing to me, but the sheer volume suggested something monumental. This was Thorne's groundbreaking work, the genetic sequencing that could reshape global health or, in the wrong hands, unleash unimaginable devastation. I could feel the weight of it, the potential implications humming beneath the surface of the data. Then, a flicker. A sequence of log entries indicating recent, sophisticated data manipulation. Not just deletions, but overwrites, a digital scrubbing designed to erase specific project files without leaving a trace. Almost. My eyes narrowed, tracing the timestamps. They were recent, within the last 48 hours, well after the estimated time of Thorne's demise. This wasn't Thorne trying to hide something himself. This was an external party. Someone had gained access, not just to the lab, but to the deepest secrets of his research. And they had been thorough. Too thorough. The system log showed an attempted wipe of an entire subdirectory, a clean sweep that should have left no recoverable data. But the technician's software, designed to uncover exactly this kind of digital ghost, found fragmented remnants. A series of partial file names, corrupted but still hinting at their original content. Pathogen resistance. Vector mutation. Accelerated replication. The words jumped out at me, cold and stark. This wasn't just about global health. This was about something that could be weaponized. I leaned back, the chair creaking softly. The meticulous nature of the wipe, the specific targeting of these files, it suggested an intimate knowledge of Thorne's work. Someone knew exactly what to look for, what to erase. Later, I found Maya in the break room, staring blankly at a half-empty mug of cooling tea. She looked smaller than he had yesterday, her usually sharp features softened by exhaustion and something else, fear. Her eyes were shadowed, her movements hesitant. "Maya," I said, my voice cutting through the silence. Her gaze darted to the door, then back to me, an almost imperceptible movement. He was protective of that, she murmured, her fingers tightening around the mug. Obsessed, really? Did he ever mention anyone else having access to it? She shook her head, slowly. No. Never. He said it was too sensitive. Too dangerous. She paused, her eyes clouding over. He started getting paranoid, you know? In the last few weeks. He thought someone was always watching. Just vague warnings. "They're coming for it," he'd mumble. "They want to control it." He was convinced his work was being monitored, that his security was compromised. I thought it was just the stress, the isolation. Her voice trailed off, a shiver running through her. But maybe. Thorne's paranoia, the targeted data wipe, the unique trace element on his wrist, it all began to coalesce into a disturbing picture. Someone had not only wanted Thorne dead, but they had also wanted his research, or at least specific parts of it, to vanish without a trace. And they had succeeded, almost. I left the lab, the weight of the new information pressing down on me. The trace element, the filtration systems, the wiped data, Thorne's fear. It wasn't a lab accident. It was a meticulously planned operation. My next stop was unavoidable. Aris Thorne lay still, a silent testament to a life cut short. The air, thick with the metallic tang of ozone and disinfectant, bit at my exposed skin. I stood over Thorne's body, a sheet pulled back to reveal the precise area of his left wrist. The cool, clinical light overhead cast long, blue shadows, making the subtle discoloration around the microscopic trace element even harder to discern. Someone had not only wanted Thorne dead, but they had also wanted his research, or at least its immediate cessation, and they had been meticulous. I guided the probe, no larger than a penlight, across the minute residue on Thorne's skin. The device hummed, a low thrumming vibration that resonated through my fingertips. On the small, integrated screen, a complex spectrum began to resolve itself. Peaks and valleys, distinct and precise, painted a molecular fingerprint. I zoomed in, isolating the unique signature that had caught my eye during the initial sweep.
And it's not anything common.
My fingers danced over the controls, running the data against known databases.
Then, a match.
Not a perfect one, but a strong candidate. A rare, synthetic polymer. My gaze snapped from the screen to the colleague.
This isn't a lab accident.
This isn't even a common industrial compound.
This is high-end.
Specialized. Think aerospace, advanced robotics, maybe even medical implants, but the kind that costs more than a small country's GDP. The colleague whistled softly. That narrows the field considerably.
No backyard chemist is synthesizing this.
Exactly, I affirmed, a knot tightening in my stomach.
This points away from disgruntled academics or rival researchers scrambling for tenure.
This points to serious money. Corporate money. I spent the next few hours cross-referencing the polymer's known applications and manufacturers. One name kept resurfacing, Omnicorp. A global conglomerate known for its aggressive R&D, its sprawling network of subsidiaries, and its reputation for acquiring promising technologies by any means necessary. They had funded some of Thorne's early work, a detail I'd initially dismissed as standard academic patronage. Now, it felt like a leash. The mystery hadn't just deepened, it had broadened, stretching its tendrils into the opaque world of corporate power.
Arranging an interview with Omnicorp's liaison proved surprisingly easy.
Too easy, perhaps. A meeting was set for late afternoon in a neutral conference room, stripped bare of any corporate branding, save for the faint, lingering scent of industrial strength cleaner. The liaison arrived promptly, a man in a meticulously tailored suit, with an unervingly calm demeanor and eyes that seemed to take everything in without betraying a single thought. He introduced himself simply as the corporate representative.
"Thank you for your time," I began, my voice even.
I watched his hands, folded neatly on the polished table, for any tell.
"We're investigating the circumstances surrounding Dr. Aris Thorne's death."
"A tragedy, of course," the corporate representative said, his voice smooth, almost practiced. "Dr. Thorne was a brilliant mind.
Omnicorp deeply regrets his passing."
Omnicorp funded some of Dr. Thorne's early research, correct?
That's correct.
We've supported numerous innovative projects over the years.
It's part of our commitment to scientific advancement.
He offered a small, polite smile that didn't quite reach his eyes.
And his later work? The project he was engaged in at the time of his death?
Dr. Thorne had moved on to more independent research by then. While we maintained a general interest in his field, Omnicorp had no direct involvement in his final project.
No direct involvement, I repeated, letting the words hang.
Yet, we found a unique synthetic polymer, tracing back to high-end industrial applications, at the scene. A polymer that, coincidentally, appears in some of Omnicorp's proprietary materials.
The corporate representative's smile faltered, a flicker of something unreadable crossing his face before it was quickly smoothed away. Omnicorp is a leader in advanced materials science.
Many of our polymers are cutting edge. It's not entirely surprising that trace elements might appear in unexpected places, especially if Dr. Thorne was experimenting with new compounds.
He paused, then added, perhaps he was attempting to replicate or even reverse engineer some of our patented materials for his own research?
Or perhaps I countered, leaning forward slightly. Someone with access to those materials was in his lab. His composure was remarkable. I assure you. Our security protocols are stringent. Access to proprietary materials is tightly controlled. And as I said, we had no active project with Dr. Thorne at that facility. So, no Omnicorp personnel would have had cause to be in his lab? Not officially, no. Not in recent memory. His phrasing was precise, almost legalistic. However, Dr. Thorne was a respected figure. He had many contacts. Perhaps a former colleague, now with Omnicorp, paid him an unofficial visit? The evasiveness, cloaked in an almost aggressive cooperativeness, was palpable. He was giving me answers, but each one seemed designed to deflect, to create a plausible deniability. He wanted to appear helpful, but every word felt like a carefully constructed barrier. And what about the data wipe? I pressed. Dr. Thorne's research data was systematically purged just prior to his death. Any thoughts on why that might be? He shrugged, a small, almost imperceptible movement of his tailored shoulders. Scientists are often particular about their intellectual property. Perhaps he was protecting his work from competitors. Thorns. We acquire, we innovate. The web of connections was beginning to reveal its first, dangerous strands. My conversation with the senior executive from Omnicorp had done little to thaw the situation, only adding another layer of ice. His words, ostensibly cooperative, had felt more like carefully constructed walls. I knew Omnicorp was involved, deeply. The threads were there, thin but unmistakable, and I intended to pull on every single one. My focus narrowed to the microscopic polymer fragment I'd extracted from Thorne's lab. It was an anomaly, a foreign body in an otherwise sterile environment, and its presence gnawed at me. Back in my personal lab, the air humming with the low thrum of diagnostic equipment, I hunched over the electron microscope. Hours blurred into a relentless pursuit, comparing the fragment's unique molecular signature against a growing database of proprietary materials, industrial compounds, and specialized plastics. The structure was complex, layered, engineered for extreme resilience and heat resistance. It wasn't off the shelf. Then, a match. Not a perfect one, but close enough to trigger an alert. The polymer shared core characteristics with a new generation of heat-shielding composites, still under development, designed for specific high-stress applications. The database entry was sparse, heavily redacted, but the manufacturer was listed, a subsidiary of Omnicorp, known for its advanced materials division. A cold certainty settled in my gut. This wasn't just a lab accident, it was a targeted event, and the killer had left their fingerprint in the very material used to contain, or perhaps create, the catastrophe. I pushed away from the microscope, the glow of the screen still imprinted on my retinas. The revelation was both a breakthrough and a warning. Omnicorp was deeper in this than I'd initially suspected, not just financially tied to Thorne, but potentially manufacturing the very material implicated in his demise. The drive home was usually a winding, unremarkable journey through the city's periphery. I was approaching a major intersection, my turn signal blinking, when a delivery van, its side panels emblazoned with a faded, generic logo, suddenly swerved from the opposite lane. It cut across the center line, tires screaming, heading directly for my driver's side door. My reflexes, honed by years of unexpected crises, took over.
I slammed on the brakes, simultaneously yanking the steering wheel hard to the right. The tires shrieked in protest, the vehicle fishtailing violently as I narrowly avoided impact. The van, without so much as a pause, corrected its course and sped through the red light, disappearing into the city's neon haze. No brake lights, no swerve to avoid me. Just a deliberate, terrifying trajectory. That wasn't an accident. The driver had looked directly at me, a blank, unreadable face behind the windshield, before committing to the maneuver. Someone was sending a message. Shaken but resolute, I continued my journey, my senses on high alert. The incident fueled my conviction. This wasn't just a complicated case, it was a dangerous one. My personal lab, a space I considered sacrosanct, felt like the only place I could truly think. When I finally reached my private workspace, the lock was undisturbed, the security system still armed. Everything appeared normal. Yet, as I stepped inside, a subtle dissonance prickled at the back of my neck. The faint scent of ozone, not from my equipment, but something sharper, almost metallic. And then I saw it, a tiny, almost imperceptible scratch on the polished chrome edge of my main analysis console. It wasn't a mark I'd left. I ran a gloved finger over the microscopic gouge. Someone had been here. Someone had bypassed my security, moved through my space, and left only the most minute, almost arrogant, sign of their presence. They hadn't taken anything obvious, hadn't disturbed my work. The message was clear, I was being watched. My investigation was no longer just a professional pursuit, it was personal. The next morning, I found the assistant, Thorne's former colleague, hunched over a lukewarm cup of coffee in the break room of the research facility. The past few days had worn on her. And about things you might not have told me. She flinched, her gaze darting around the empty room as if expecting to see someone listening. Omnicorp. And someone tried to run me off the road last night. Someone also visited my lab. Her face went pale, the last vestiges of color draining away. She stared at the polymer fragment, then at me, her lower lip trembling. The fear in her eyes was raw, palpable. He was so careful, she finally choked out, her voice barely audible. Thorne was paranoid, almost. Especially these last few months. He said his work was too valuable, too dangerous, to fall into the wrong hands. She gripped her coffee mug, her knuckles white. There was someone. Before it happened. I saw him. Not from Omnicorp, not anyone I recognized. He'd come in late, after everyone else had left. Thorne would let him in, sometimes through a side entrance, sometimes the main, but never logging him in properly. No visitor pass. No record. Just. And Thorne would be different after those visits. More agitated. More secretive. When was this? I asked, leaning forward, every word she uttered tightening the knot in my stomach. The last few weeks. Up until that night. He was there the night before. I saw him leave, just as I was locking up. He looked satisfied. And Thorne looked terrified. An unknown individual. Accessing the lab after hours, unrecorded, clandestine, and Thorne, terrified. This wasn't just corporate espionage gone wrong. This was something far more intricate, far more personal. The web had just grown exponentially more complex, and infinitely more dangerous. The glow of the monitor cast a pallid light across my face, reflecting in the scratched surface of my desk. Hours bled into each other, the only markers the subtle shift in the city's hum outside my window and the deepening ache in my shoulders. Thorne's lab wasn't just a workspace, it was a digital fortress. Every environmental control, every piece of equipment, every door access, logged in cross-referenced. I was drowning in data, a forensic archaeologist sifting through layers of digital sediment. My fingers danced across the keyboard, a rhythmic click-clack against the late-night silence. I'd pulled every byte from the lab's central server, from the local terminals, even from the encrypted backups Thorne had squirreled away. The initial reports had painted a picture of a catastrophic equipment failure, a spontaneous combustion of innovative, volatile research. But the microscopic trace I'd found, the unusual burn pattern, they whispered a different story, one of deliberate, meticulous orchestration. I focused on the atmospheric controls, the bespoke system Thorne had designed to maintain precise conditions for his sensitive bioreactors. Standard operating procedures dictated a narrow range of parameters. Yet, here it was, stark against the baseline, a rapid, inexplicable drop in localized atmospheric pressure, followed by an equally sharp spike in a specific gas mixture. Not an explosion, not a leak, but a controlled injection. The timestamps were unnerving in their precision, occurring moments before the primary power conduit to Thorne's workstation overloaded. It wasn't a malfunction. It was a sequence. I cross-referenced the environmental logs with the security camera footage, the low-resolution, fisheye lens view from the corner of the lab, just outside the blast radius. Thorne was hunched over his console, absorbed. Then, a subtle shimmer in the air, barely perceptible, a ripple of disturbance. He flinched, his head snapping up, his movements quickening, a frantic scramble to override something, anything. His hands flew across the console, but the system wasn't responding to his commands. It was already under external control. The system logs confirmed my suspicion. A remote trigger. Someone had infiltrated Thorne's network, waiting for the precise moment, then unleashed a carefully choreographed sequence of events. First, the pressure drop, disorienting, perhaps even causing subtle physiological effects. Then, the specific gas mixture, designed to react with something already present in Thorne's immediate workspace, or perhaps to simply enhance the next stage. Finally, the electrical surge, a controlled overload of the primary power conduit, precisely timed to coincide with the atmospheric changes. This wasn't a random act of corporate sabotage. This was personal, intimate. The attacker hadn't just known the lab's layout, they had understood Thorne's specific experimental protocols, his unique gas mixtures, the exact vulnerabilities in his bespoke environmental system. They had weaponized his own genius against him. My chair scraped against the floor as I stood, stretching the knots from my back. Thorne lay beneath a sheet, a silent testament to the violence he had endured. I pulled back the covering, my gaze sweeping over him, not just seeing the damage from the blast, but now understanding its genesis. The contusions, the subtle internal bleeding, they aligned perfectly with the rapid pressure changes I'd charted. His airways, meticulously examined by the lead pathologist, had shown traces of an unusual compound, dismissed as byproduct of the fire. But now, it clicked. It was the residue of the injected gas mixture, designed to interact, to incapacitate, to ensure he couldn't fight back, couldn't stop. The inevitable. The killer hadn't merely killed Thorne, they had meticulously disassembled him, piece by agonizing piece, through a carefully orchestrated dance of technology and chemistry. The web had indeed grown exponential, and I was just beginning to untangle its deadly threads. The air was dry and frigid, carrying the faint, metallic scent I'd grown accustomed to. My breath plumed faintly in front of me, a small cloud of transient existence in the stark, sterile environment. Thorne's body, or what remained of it after the explosion and subsequent fire, lay beneath a thin, opaque sheet on the gurney. The attending forensic technician, a quiet professional with precise movements, had already catalogued the obvious. My interest lay in the less obvious. I peeled back the sheet, the cool synthetic material whispering against itself. The sight, even after all these years, always held a moment of grim gravity. The blast had been localized, contained, yet brutal. The burn patterns, however, were what continued to gnaw at me. They were too precise, too controlled for a simple accident. The edges of the thermal damage on the torso, the way the synthetic fibers of his lab coat had fused in certain areas while others remained merely scorched, it spoke of directed energy. Not a random uncontrolled detonation. Anything new for me, Reed? The forensic technician asked, his voice low, respectful of the dead. He stood a few feet away, observing my meticulous scrutiny. Just confirming my suspicions, I murmured, my gaze tracing a particularly deep cauterization along Thorne's left arm. Near the wrist. The initial reports cited a volatile chemical reaction, right? That was the working theory, the technician confirmed. The pressure wave. The heat. It fit the profile. Too well, I countered, almost to myself. My gloved fingers hovered inches above the damaged tissue. This wasn't the chaotic devastation of an accident. It was a murder method of extraordinary complexity, demanding not only intimate knowledge of Thorne's lab and its volatile components but also an understanding of forensic investigation itself. Someone had gone to great lengths to sculpt the scene, to write a false narrative with fire and force. Why such an elaborate charade? If the killer merely wanted Thorne's groundbreaking research, a simple theft and a less destructive, less traceable death would have sufficed. The sheer intricacy of the execution suggested a motive far deeper than intellectual property theft. It hinted at a desire to prevent something, to stop Thorne's work from reaching completion, or worse, from ever seeing the light of day. My mind drifted back to the digital architecture of Thorne's lab, the labyrinthine network I'd spent days dissecting. There were gaps, subtle inconsistencies I couldn't shake. I'd copied Thorne's primary research drive, a safeguard, before the corporate security detail had swept in. I connected it to a secure, isolated network I'd established, my fingers already flying across the virtual keyboard. I bypassed the standard directories, ignoring the project files that had been so carefully curated for public consumption. My focus was on the hidden pathways, the ghost files, the encrypted partitions that wouldn't show up on a casual scan. Thorne was brilliant, but brilliance often came with its own set of habits, digital fingerprints left in the rush of creation. I remembered a peculiar data packet, flagged as corrupted, that I dismissed as network noise during my initial sweep. It wasn't corrupted. It was cloaked. The tablets fan whirred softly, a counterpoint to the room's constant hum. Then, a new directory appeared, a string of alphanumeric characters that meant nothing on its own, but its presence was everything. It wasn't linked to any of Thorne's known projects.
I double-tapped, and a login prompt appeared.
This was the moment.
Thorne had always been meticulous, but also fiercely independent. He wouldn't have left this unprotected if it were trivial.
Nothing. My gaze flickered to the
body, to the faint, almost imperceptible discoloration beneath his left thumbnail. I remembered finding a similar, almost invisible residue on his lab bench, a minute quantity of a rare earth element used in advanced data storage. I typed in a sequence, a complex string derived from the atomic weight of that specific element, combined with a variable based on the date of his initial patent filing. It was a long shot, a leap of intuition based on the man's intellectual signature. The screen flickered.
Access granted.
A cascade of files opened, not research data, but personal logs. Encrypted, dated entries, raw and unedited. I scrolled quickly, the tension in my chest tightening with each word. Thorne's voice, filtered through the digital medium, was clear, urgent. My work on Project Chimera has reached a critical juncture.
The applications are profound, but the ethical implications even more so. Omnicorp's funding, initially a godsend, has become a cage.
I leaned closer, the tablet's cold metal against my cheek.
Omnicorp.
The corporate giant that had so swiftly tried to shut down my investigation, citing proprietary research.
They are pushing for weaponization.
Not just of Chimera, but of a parallel project, one I only recently became aware of.
No trace. Like Thorne's death. The pieces began to click into place, a horrifying mosaic. I cannot allow this.
My original intent was humanitarian.
I have gathered enough evidence, enough digital breadcrumbs, to expose Omnicorp's true agenda.
I intend to release these findings, publicly, within the next 72 hours. The world needs to know what they are truly building. The entry was dated 3 days before his death. The hum of the refrigeration unit was no longer just background noise, it was a sinister drone, amplifying the gravity of Thorne's final words.
This wasn't about theft. My gaze swept back to the silent form under the sheet. He hadn't been a victim of circumstance. He'd been a martyr. And I was standing on the precipice of something far larger, far more dangerous, than I had ever anticipated. The killer wasn't just protecting a secret, they were protecting a weapon. And they knew I was getting closer. The entry was dated 3 days before his death. The cold room, already frigid, seemed to drop another 10 degrees. This wasn't about theft. It was about SI. Silencing. The word hung in the air, unsaid, yet undeniably present in my mind. The air was thin, smelling faintly of antiseptic and something metallic, like old blood, though the room itself was spotless. My breath plumed in front of me, obscuring the holographic display I'd projected onto a nearby wall. It cycled through a dizzying array of data, access logs, security footage stills, Thorne's encrypted research notes, the detailed forensic scans of the explosion site. My eyes, however, kept returning to the entry from Thorne's personal journal, specifically the fragmented phrase, "Not theft." That changed everything. If it wasn't about stealing his research, then it was about preventing its dissemination, or perhaps preventing him from doing something with it. That implied a level of control, of intimate knowledge, that went beyond simple corporate espionage. This was personal, or at least, deeply strategic.
I needed to find someone who had both the means to execute such a sophisticated sabotage and a motive compelling enough to risk everything. I pulled up the comprehensive list of personnel with high-level access to Thorne's secure facility. The names blurred into a long scroll, each one a potential thread in a vast, tangled web. My focus sharpened. The explosion wasn't just an accident, it was meticulously engineered to look like one. The specific burn patterns, the precise sequence of events that led to the reactor core breach, the microscopic residue that pointed to a tailored accelerant, these weren't random. They required an intimate understanding of Thorne's proprietary technology, its vulnerabilities, and the lab's intricate security systems. I cross-referenced the access logs with the timelines of the sabotage. Who was in the facility, or had remote access, at critical junctures? Who had the specific technical background to not only understand Thorne's groundbreaking work but also to destabilize it so effectively? I filtered the list by expertise: advanced bioengineering, quantum mechanics, high-security systems architecture. The initial pool of hundreds quickly shrank to dozens, then to a tight cluster of 7 individuals. Each one was brilliant, each had reason to be near Thorne's work, but none immediately screamed killer. My gaze drifted to the employee profiles, searching for anomalies, for anything that didn't quite fit. I looked at career trajectories, past projects, any disciplinary actions, even minor ones. The process was painstaking, a slow, methodical grind through digital lives. I zoomed in on the profiles of the remaining 7. One name, in particular, kept resurfacing in the peripheral data: the Omnicorp liaison. The records listed him as David Thorne, no relation to Aris, the system confirmed, but the coincidence of names always snagged my attention, however briefly. His profile was remarkably clean, almost too clean. A stellar academic record, rapid ascent within Omnicorp, impeccable references. But as I dug deeper, past the surface-level summaries, I found faint echoes of something else. His listed expertise was broad, almost suspiciously so, encompassing not just corporate strategy but also risk assessment and mitigation, with a background in specialized operational logistics. The phrasing was deliberately vague, corporate speak designed to obscure rather than reveal. The results began to trickle in, painting a different picture. Specialized operational logistics was a euphemism, I soon discovered. He wasn't just a corporate liaison, he was an operative. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. Then came the true revelation, buried deep within a redacted report from nearly a decade ago. A scandal involving stolen intellectual property, a cutting-edge energy design, and the disappearance of its lead inventor. The incident had been quietly suppressed, attributed to a rogue industrial spy, but the report mentioned a key figure involved in the recovery operation, a young, ambitious field agent named David Thorne. The stolen design, eerily similar in its revolutionary scope to Aris Thorne's research, had ultimately resurfaced years later, slightly modified, under Omnicorp's patent. My breath hitched in the cold air. David Thorne, the Omnicorp liaison, wasn't just an observer, he was a highly trained operative with a history of involvement in cases of stolen intellectual property, where the original inventor often vanished. He had the covert operations background, the technical acumen to understand and sabotage Aris Thorne's work, and the direct corporate connection to benefit from its control. Aris Thorne's journal entry echoed in my mind, *, this wasn't about theft. David Thorne wasn't just a suspect, he was now the prime suspect. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I was finally looking at the inside man. My gaze drifted to the employee profiles, searching for anomalies, for anything that didn't quite fit. I zoomed in on the profiles of those closest to Aris Thorne, including his corporate executive relative, scrutinizing every detail. The corporate executive's rise within Omnicorp was rapid, almost too smooth. A few years back, Aris Thorne's research had hit a wall, a period of stagnation. Then, a sudden, explosive breakthrough, followed by the corporate executive's promotion to a key oversight position directly related to Aris's division. The timing felt less like coincidence and more like orchestration. My finger tapped the desk. It was time to stop guessing and start provoking. I needed a reaction, something that would pull the killer out of the shadows. The only way to do that was to make them believe I was closer than I actually was. I began drafting an internal memo, ostensibly for my superiors, detailing a significant development in the Aris Thorne case. I fabricated a preliminary finding, hinting that Aris's final project wasn't just groundbreaking, but that its true nature, previously obscured, was now becoming alarmingly clear. I implied that Aris had been on the verge of exposing something far more insidious than corporate espionage, and that my team had just found a crucial data fragment confirming it. I made sure to embed a unique, almost imperceptible digital marker in the document, ensuring I could track its access. Then, with a calculated click, I accidentally misdirected the memo to a broader internal distribution list, including the corporate executive's secure terminal. The waiting was the hardest part. I set up a surveillance feed on the evidence processing area, a secure server farm where Aris's project data was being painstakingly reconstructed and analyzed. It was a sterile, humming space, monitored by multiple cameras and restricted access points. The corporate executive had legitimate clearance for various high-level data, but not for the specific forensic server where Aris's most sensitive encrypted files resided. I watched the clock tick, the hours blurring into a dull ache behind my eyes. Just after midnight, a flicker. A security alert pinged on my console, an unauthorized access attempt on the forensic server. The feed showed a figure, cloaked in shadow, moving with practiced stealth. It was the corporate executive. He navigated the labyrinthine corridors with an unnerving familiarity, his movements precise and economical. He reached the server rack, a small, sophisticated device clutched in his gloved hand. He was attempting to inject a data-corrupting agent, a digital poison designed to erase any trace of Aris's true work. I moved. My boots echoed softly on the polished concrete as I approached the server farm. The access door hissed open, revealing the corporate executive hunched over a terminal, his device poised. He straightened slowly, his hands still near the keyboard. "Just checking on the progress of the investigation, Reed. Concerned about the integrity of company assets." His voice was calm, too calm, a thin veneer over raw desperation. "You mean the integrity of your carefully constructed alibi?" I stepped fully into the room, letting the light illuminate my face. "That memo I sent? A fabrication. A lure. They have a way of clinging to things. Like a specific polymer, for instance. A very unique, highly specialized compound, designed for specific high-energy containment fields. The kind Aris Thorne was experimenting with. The kind that was found, in microscopic quantities, at the scene of your accident with the security chief. Again, within the precise blast radius in Aris's lab. His eyes flickered, a telltale sign of recognition.
Coincidence, he muttered.
The word lacked conviction.
No, not coincidence.
I held up a clear evidence bag containing a minute, almost invisible speck. This polymer, Aris's signature compound, was found on the security chief's comm unit, the one he was using just before his accident. And it matches the residue in Aris's lab. It's a marker, a fingerprint of a very specific kind of energy discharge. The kind that could be weaponized. Stainless steel surfaces gleamed under the harsh overhead lights, reflecting our distorted figures. Something he was about to blow wide open. He finally broke. He was unstable, paranoid. Or principled, I countered. He found something. Something unethical. Something Omnicorp was pushing, even against his warnings. He nodded, a jerky, desperate movement. A faction within Omnicorp. They tasked me. Aris was developing a bioweapon, a targeted pathogen, under the guise of medical research. He discovered their true intentions. He threatened to go public, to expose them. They couldn't allow that. Not with billions invested, with the potential for global contracts. So you neutralized him, I finished, the word hanging heavy in the cold air. You used his own research against him. The polymer, the energy discharge, you engineered his death to look like a lab accident, a tragic miscalculation of his own making. It was the only way. I had to protect the company. Protect my family. His voice cracked, the confession spilling out in a torrent of desperate justification. He was my brother, Reed. But he was a liability. A threat to everything. The confession had been a dam breaking, not with a sudden roar, but a slow, agonizing leak that soaked every corner of the interrogation room. David Thorne, once a picture of corporate composure, now slumped, his face a roadmap of regret and fear. The uniformed officers moved in swiftly, their movements efficient, devoid of judgment, just procedure. I watched them secure him, the click of the cuffs echoing in the sudden silence. He didn't resist, didn't even look up as they escorted him away, his pleas for family and company fading down the corridor. My colleagues, the lead detective and a federal agent, exchanged grim nods. The initial shock of the betrayal, the audacity of the cover-up, was slowly giving way to the grinding reality of paperwork and wider implications. I knew this was just the beginning. David Thorne was a key, but the lock was far larger, encompassing the very foundations of Omnicorp. I didn't linger. The air in the interrogation room felt stale, heavy with unspoken truths. My work, for now, was done there. I needed to see Aris Thorne one last time, not as a collection of evidence, but as the man whose death had ripped open this corporate underbelly. The trauma center cold room awaiting examination was a sterile box, hushed and dim. The fluorescent lights hummed with a low, almost mournful sound. The attendant, a quiet individual with weary eyes, nodded me in without a word. Aris Thorne lay on a gurney, shrouded under a white sheet, the outlines of his form stark and final. I stood for a moment, simply observing the still bundle. The faint scent of antiseptic and something deeper, more metallic, hung in the air. This was the true aftermath, the quiet cost of ambition and fear. I pulled back the sheet, just enough to see his face. It was still, composed in a way it hadn't been in life, stripped of the brilliance and the burden. The burns were gone, the disfigurement of the lab replaced by the careful work of the forensic team. What remained was the quiet dignity of a man who had been consumed by his work, and then by the very people he trusted. My gaze drifted to his hands, still bearing the faint, unique scar patterns I'd meticulously documented. These were the hands that had built something world-changing, something that had scared the powerful enough to orchestrate his demise. David Thorne's confession had confirmed it all: the deliberate sabotage, the staged accident, the intricate layers of deception designed to look like a tragic miscalculation. He'd confessed to altering the safety protocols, to ensuring the explosion was contained enough to destroy the man but not the research. A sacrifice, he'd called it, for the greater good of Omnicorp, for his family's future, for a vision he claimed Aris Thorne had strayed from. I covered him again, the sheets settling softly. The quiet here was a stark contrast to the cacophony I knew was erupting outside. My phone, buzzing in my pocket, confirmed it. The news had broken. David Thorne's arrest, the implication of a high-level corporate conspiracy, was a grenade detonating in the public square. Walking out of the trauma center, the world felt sharper, louder. The name Omnicorp was being dragged through the mud, its stock plummeting, its reputation in tatters. The lead detective met me in the corridor, a phone pressed to his ear, his face tight with controlled urgency. He disconnected, shaking his head. "They're moving fast. Federal agents are swarming Omnicorp's headquarters. The CEO, the lead legal counsel, they're being brought in for questioning. It's a full-blown federal investigation now, Reed. Bigger than any of us anticipated." I nodded. The information settling like cold stones in my gut. This wasn't just about a murder anymore. It was about power, control, and the dangerous precipice where scientific innovation met unchecked ambition. The ethical debate was already spiraling, fueled by speculation about Aris Thorne's final project. The air thrummed with tension, a palpable unease that stretched beyond the immediate arrests. The public outcry was deafening, a mix of outrage and fear. What exactly had Aris Thorne created? And who would wield its power now that its creator was gone and his company in disarray? My meticulous search for truth had uncovered a monster far larger than a single killer, a web of deceit woven by those who valued profit and control over human life. The true aftermath, I realized, was only just beginning. The metallic tang of ozone and disinfectant still clung to the air in the trauma center cold room awaiting examination, a scent that always seemed to underscore the finality of my work. I stood before a stainless steel table, the last remnants of Aris Thorne's case spread out before me, a series of high-resolution photographs, a final report from the chief investigator, and a small, sealed evidence bag containing the minuscule, telltale residue that had cracked the facade of an accident. The air conditioning hummed, a low, steady drone, a counterpoint to the silence in my own head. It was over. The corporate executive, the one who had funded Thorne's research for years, was in custody. Not just for the murder of Thorne, but for the planned acquisition and weaponization of his final project, a bioengineered compound capable of rewriting genetic predispositions. The executive hadn't merely wanted to steal the research, they wanted to control the very blueprint of human potential, market it under the guise of therapeutic advancement, and eliminate anyone who stood in the way of that absolute power. Thorne's accident was meant to be the perfect cover, a tragic end to a brilliant mind, allowing the executive to step in, claim the research as their own, and shape the future according to their twisted vision. My gaze drifted to a particular photograph, the scorched remains of Thorne's lab, the specific burn pattern that, under the right magnification, told a story of deliberate ignition, not spontaneous combustion. The executive's network of shell companies and offshore accounts, meticulously uncovered by the Financial Crimes Unit, had painted a picture of ambition unconstrained by morality. They had orchestrated the entire scenario, down to the precise timing of the explosion and the subtle manipulation of lab safety protocols to ensure Thorne was trapped. The closure of the case felt less like victory and more like a heavy weight settling on my shoulders. The ethical debate surrounding his work, initially whispered in academic circles, had now erupted into a public firestorm. The idea that someone could engineer traits, eliminate predispositions to illness, or even enhance cognitive function was exhilarating, terrifying, and deeply polarizing. Thorne, for all his reclusiveness, had unwittingly opened Pandora's box, and the executive had been poised to unleash its contents upon the world. This case had been different. It wasn't just about a life taken, but about the potential corruption of an entire scientific frontier. The microscopic trace, the unusual burn pattern, the subtle inconsistencies in the executive's alibi, each piece had been a thread in a tapestry of deceit, leading me down a path where the lines between innovation and exploitation blurred. The personal toll was undeniable. Sleep had become a fractured landscape of formulas and charred remnants, my mind constantly replaying the moments leading up to Thorne's death. Yet, even with that heavy knowledge, my commitment to this work remained unyielding. The truth, no matter how uncomfortable, had to be unearthed. It was the only way to safeguard what little integrity remained in a world so eager to sacrifice it for power. I picked up the sealed evidence bag. Inside, a tiny, almost invisible fragment of a unique polymer, traced back to a specific manufacturing process only accessible to the executive's private research facilities, lay inert. It was the final, irrefutable link. The reveal of how the executive had not only orchestrated Thorne's death but had also planted the specific residue to frame a rival, only to have my team's meticulous work uncover the deeper truth, felt like a small, quiet victory in a larger, ongoing war. The event of this final piece of evidence being formally catalogued and added to the prosecution's file was a quiet, almost anticlimactic end to months of relentless pursuit. I placed the evidence bag back down, then gathered the photographs and reports, sliding them into a heavy-duty folder. Thorne's case was closed, the perpetrator identified, their motives laid bare. But the questions it raised, the profound ethical challenges about where to draw the line between progress and peril, would linger long after the headlines faded. How many more brilliant minds would become pawns in such dangerous games? How many more world-changing discoveries would tempt those who sought not to uplift humanity, but to control it? The struggle for justice was a continuous one, a relentless push against the currents of deception and greed.